Jim Morris, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. You've written a lot of books. Um, and in preparation for this discussion, I've gone back to the beginning, War Story, um, this great memoir of the war, which is really unique. I mean, I've read hundreds of memoirs in the Vietnam War, and yours is quite unique. The war was my life, and I identified with it totally. I mean, one of the things that's very unique about your memoir, and it brings to my mind, the question of what's the difference between a soldier and a true warrior. I mean, someone who is just sort of born a warrior. The war was my life and I identified with it totally. And repeatedly in this memoir, you say, I loved walking in the jungle. There was something thrilling about combat. I loved the Montagnards.
Well,
I'm interested in just hearing your thoughts.
well, the walking in the jungle thing. First of all, uh, I was in different kinds of jungle on different
Mm,
tours,
yeah.
and the first one, uh, it was really not so much a jungle as a forest.
Mm,
It was beautiful. It was just beautiful country, and to walk along there, and of course you had to be quiet. Um, so nobody was yammering in your ear, and I could just lose myself in thought. And well, you want to be pretty alert when you're on a combat patrol, obviously. But
yeah.
I was walking behind the point. If I, wa- I if firing broke out or something else happened, I would be plugged back in instantly. But that's where I did most of my planning, and it was like I had a kind of a picture in my head of this province and roughly where the infiltration routes were and that sort of thing. And so I was always thinking, okay, how can we, we're just wandering around here waiting to get shot at. How can we do the other thing? How can we know where we can sit and wait for them?
Wait
You
for them.
know,
Yeah.
the bad guys. I want to ambush the bad guys. I don't want to be ambushed by the bad guys. And
Yeah.
so I was scheming. That's what you would call it. I was scheming to uh, to kill people. Granted, all those people were trying to kill me, so I didn't feel bad about that. But I would just walk along and say, okay, how can we do this? How can we do this? How can we do this? What can we do? You know,
Mm-hmm.
and it was very freeing. It was very freeing to be
Yeah.
uh, away from every. I didn't. I wasn't getting messages from the B team. I wasn't getting anything. We were so far out of out of touch that we had maybe two contacts a day by CW radio. So we
Yeah.
were isolated on patrol, fairly isolated, and it was you could have you could carry a thought for 3 hours. You can really explore a subject in your mind,
Wow.
and I
Yeah.
just I love that.
Gosh, you've said a few things that I'd love to follow up on. There's a quote. I'm looking for it right in front of me. Yeah, here it is. Here's another quote. And I wonder if what you were just saying kind of touches on this. I had lost self-importance in the face of the momentous events around me. I forget the exact content of the context of that specific sentence, but when you're walking through the jungle, it's quiet, you can think, but the things you're thinking about are of incredible importance. Survival for
Yeah,
myself, the survival, you're the officer, so the survival of the
it was
guys I'm in
intense. It
command
was
of.
intense.
Is that what I'm trying to find the right word? I mean, is that what, the sense of, that you say repeatedly in the memoir, there's something about this that I loved. I hated being in the office. I just wanted to, get back out there, and it angered me when they wouldn't let me get back out there. Was it that intensity and that sense of importance? Was that part of what made this so significant for you?
Um, it's hard to say. Um, it was just I had grown up more or less in isolation.
Mm,
I don't want to go into all that childhood trauma stuff, um, but I felt so free, and I had, I was the main mug. I mean, everybody looked to me for the decisions,
wow.
and these were the kind of decisions I'd trained almost my entire life to make. So, um, you know, I was just plugged in. I had been pretty bored my entire life,
Mm,
the way I grew up, and it was the contrast of that and just being engaged, you know, 100% engaged. And uh, I was the team I was on, being working with those guys. Um, okay, our CEO, Chris McCullough, who is to this day the finest man I've ever met, and he was told to put two teams together as the adjutant. That's the personnel manager. And so one of the teams had a commander assigned, and he, as far as possible, gave that guy who he wanted. And the other team, he built his dream team. And then he convinced the old man to let him take it. So he had built his dream team. Now, when we were in pre-deployment training, I went over to group personnel and uh, checked out everybody's records. And one of the things I checked, because I knew we had some pretty smart guys, and the average IQ on that team was 126.
wow.
That's the average. The junior man on the team retired to the highest rank of any of us. It was Bill Foodie, who was our junior medic, and he retired as a full colonel in the Air Force as a
Mm,
surgeon. These were really savvy dudes, and they were a joy to work with because, I talk about how total my commitment was. We were all that way. We
wow.
were all in.
And what
And
years you did a few tours in Vietnam, if I have that right.
yeah,
But what
the
year?
first one I went in December '63,
Wow.
and we came home actually on the 20th anniversary of D-Day. Uh, June,
So
yeah, June 6th,
66 then,
1964.
or
So it was a
64,
6 month.
right? Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a 6 month tour. Then I caught another team pretty quick. Um, okay. The first time I went down, I got promoted to captain on the day we went, but I was in a first lieutenant slot. So there were two captains on the team.
Mm,
Cruz, who was quite senior, and me. I was the most junior captain in the Army at that point.
mm,
Uh, I mean, he pinned the bars on me on the airplane as we went.
wow.
And so the next one I caught, I was the CO.
And
Um, and we were in a totally different place. We were on the border, on the Laotian border, maybe 10, 15 clicks from the Laotian border, um, in a very, very, very rugged area. I mean, the last patrol I went on, we were out for 6 days. We were 10 kilometers from the camp, and we had moved all day, every day.
wow.
But we'd start out on top of the mountain, eat lunch in the creek at the bottom of the mountain, and end that day on top of another mountain. So we had probably moved 50 or 60 kilometers up and down, but as the crow flies, we'd only gone 10.
Mm, wow.
Um, and you couldn't
Wow.
see, the jungle was so thick that you couldn't see more than 3 feet in any direction. You could see the trail. You could see a little ways down the trail, and these were old Montagnard trails that had been there forever, as long,
Right.
a long time.
So you go into Vietnam for the first time then December 63, just a month after Diem is assassinated. And then when do you leave Vietnam for the last time?
Well, in the Army, I left in March of 68. Now, I went back as a correspondent in 73.
So I'm really interested in your thoughts about, and I know you're in different parts of the country. Um, so you go in for the first time December 63. Diem was assassinated just a month before. You leave in
Right.
March 68. Tet Tet's winding down. I mean, the major combat of Tet has taken place, but um, that's winding down. How in as you look back on seeing sort of how things were going in Vietnam from late 63 to early 68, how would you describe that transition? Did it seem to you that, the what was your impression of how the war was going? Seeing it so early and then, all going all the way through Tet, and you were there during Tet.
Well, of course, it was all advisory in the first tour,
Yeah.
and it was the first combat troops. The first U.S. troops were just starting to come in 65. I've mentioned my admiration for my CO, Cruz McCullough. Well, he was an artillery officer and he needed command time. That was before Special Forces was a branch.
Mm.
And so we were all sort of, it was the Army considered a Special Forces tour kind of a detour. And so as soon as we got back to Okinawa, Cruz transferred to the 173rd. He was battery commander in the artillery in the 173rd. And about a month after I got back from the second tour, he came over to my house and he said, and mind you, this would have been maybe January of 1965. And he was in 173rd. They were getting geared up to go to Vietnam. And he said, Jim, we're going to lose this war, and I don't want to stick around to watch.
Wow.
Now, nobody who knew this guy thought he would retire with less than 3 stars. I mean, he was a comer, and he resigned from the Army on orders for CNGS and on the advanced promotion list for major. In other words, he was going to be on the 5% list. 5% of the officers have a shot at an early promotion. He was one of those guys, and he just left.
Wow.
It's just I'm not going to participate in something that's
And
not being done.
this is January 65 before the Marines go into Da Nang.
Yeah,
Wow.
but he was part of the Army's effort to get ready to go to Vietnam in units, in combat units.
Now you had you had spent time in Vietnam yourself. Um, what was your response when he said that?
Um, well, I thought, well, that's probably true, but we could change. I mean, my hope was, um, that we would wake up and get squared away and do what was necessary to win there. Um, I mean, you don't go into a war and you don't put your life on the line for a sure loser. You just don't do
Mm.
that. Why would you do that? And so I hope we would kind of wake up and get organized. Um, that really never did happen.
Well, there's a quote I have here. You say, "I knew how to win this war, and I could demonstrate it if given half a chance."
Well,
Let's
that was my idea, and it was a bit of hubris there. Um, but everybody that went to Vietnam had their own plan for how we could win the war,
Mm.
and they were very different. You know, some people thought we ought to just pave the place, and you know, if the VC can't sneak through the jungle if there's no jungle
The
anymore. You
jungle.
know,
Right.
um, and the other one was you know, Hearts and Minds, which I was kind of an extreme Hearts and Minds guy, but I wanted to do that, but I wanted to do it in a way that was taking full advantage of the intelligence potential of it. You know, I mean, our intelligence in Vietnam all the way through was pathetic. You know, I mean, we had great reconnaissance units, but in terms of being able to sneak guys into the other side and no, they knew how to organize against that, and we didn't. And
Mm.
I'm I'm convinced that many of our counterparts in the Arvin were working for the other guys.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. That is that what you're getting at? Because you mentioned a number of times in the memoir, in the memoir, just an assumption that VC had infiltrated our units, some of our units, and you're saying that the U.S. South Vietnamese side wasn't good at infiltrating the VC and being able to pass information back.
I don't think they were. You know, they had their political organization and their political commissars, and you know, they took a very close look at everybody. You know what, and basically you better be motivated. You know, you better be a good little ant
Mm.
in the ant colony.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, we weren't that way at all. We just trained people how to fight, and their loyalty was well. In SF, we just assumed that 15% of our troops were working for the other guys.
Wow.
We're just kind of a guide figure,
Now,
you
is
know.
that is Arvin, right? You're not
Well, I never had any contact. I'd had no contact with ARVN units at all. These were our CIDG troops.
okay.
You know, they're local people.
Now, but that would not include the Montagnards, right?
Yeah, it would.
It would.
Yeah, there were. I mean, the VC they tried to organize the Montagnard just like they did everybody else. Um, the problem they had with organizing the Montagnards was uh, they were Vietnamese. The most racial animosity, the most intense racial animosity that I've ever experienced was between the Montagnards and the Vietnamese, and it went both ways. They hated each other. I
Wow.
mean, just flat. Most Montagnards, even if they spoke Vietnamese, wouldn't admit it. I'll give you an example. One of our company commanders was a guy named Ne Pin, who was just terrific. And he was, in fact, the adopted son of um, our senior radio man, our senior commo man, Ken Miller, who
Hmm.
was Ken was the oldest guy on the team. He'd been in the Navy in World War II. He was in his
Wow.
40s, and he just loved Napin, and he wasn't legal, but he adopted him. He considered him his son.
Wow.
Okay, Penn came to us, and his mother was in a village down south, about 20 clicks maybe, uh, near a town called Kalui, and there was a bridge down there, and the Vietnamese had bridge guards, you know, just to make sure that, well, they weren't making sure of anything, but they were supposed to make sure that only the right people crossed the bridge. Well, they
Hmm.
had no way to do that, and they were too stupid to do it for the most part. I mean, they were, I mean, not to denigrate Vietnamese intelligence, which is quite impressive in many areas, but
Yeah.
these were privates guarding the bridge,
Hmm.
and one of them was just extremely bored guarding the bridge, and he saw this old lady with a rice basket walking towards her longhouse, and he decided that he would amuse himself by plinking at her heels with his carbine.
Hmm.
And so, naturally, since somebody was shooting just behind her. She started to run for the house, and this guy got kind of carried away, and he picked her off the steps as she was going into her own house. And that was Napin's mother. So we went to the province chief to complain about this, and his response was, "What do you want me to do about it? It's just another savage." I mean, he could not grasp the fact, and this Major Chi was an intelligent man, but the idea that he should have some loyalty to people who were theoretically fighting for him was just,
It
he didn't
sounds
get
like,
it.
I mean, it sounds to me like we're talking about civil war within civil war. You've got North,
Oh
South,
yeah, absolutely.
Vietcong versus South Vietnamese, and
Montagnards,
Montagnard against Vietnamese.
the Montagnards were, they don't care. They didn't care. We were paying them to kill Vietnamese. Now we designated which Vietnamese we wanted them to kill, but their motive was to kill Vietnamese.
Wow.
And they'd have been very happy to be whacking the ones that we were allegedly allies with. And for that matter, the ones that we were allies with would have been perfectly happy to whack them. There was a lot of that went on. So it was. I tell people sometimes I wasn't really in the Vietnam War. I was in another war that was going on in the same country at the same time.
I mean, that's the sense I have. In the memoir, there's a line, I don't have the exact words, but it's near the end, and you say something like the Vietnamese and communism deserved each other. But then there's that sentence, I have it right in front of me. I loved the Montagnards. And this is
Oh
something
yeah,
that you say again and again. What was it about them, working with them, being among them, that leads you to write that? I loved them.
they were straightforward. You know, um,
Hmm.
all pretty much. I mean, the Vietnamese are basically a kind of Chinese, a kind of Southern Chinese. It's a basically Chinese culture, even though they are separate from and at odds with China. Um, it's and they're devious. I mean, their thought patterns are serpentine, and Americans are pretty straightforward, and the Montagnards were pretty straightforward, and we just hit it off, you know. Um,
Hmm.
and they were very brave. Um, they One of the things that the Montagnards say is that Montagnards don't lie, and that's kind of true. Well, the thing is, yeah, they don't lie, but they're very subjective. You know what I mean? I mean, they'll tell you what they really think, but what they think is what they want to think. It's not.
So they may not tell an overt lie, but they may not necessarily tell you the truth either. They'll just keep that to themselves.
Yeah.
I want to pick up on something that you were saying a minute ago, and you said it kind of in a maybe a joking way, but I'm wondering if there's something to it. I mean, do you kind of have a sense that, I mean, yes, I was in the Vietnam War as people think of the Vietnam War, but really I was kind of more in the Montagnard War against the Vietnamese. Do you really kind of have that sense that that's really the war you were more involved in?
Well, it was kind of a, a bifurcation kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, you know, I for a long time I really just disliked the Vietnamese because of what they did to the Montagnards. I mean, there are, but I could never maintain that with any particular Vietnamese because I would meet them and like them.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And okay, and on the third tour, my first assignment, and on the third tour, I was the S5 in Pleiku. I was basically in charge of faith and good works. I mean, I was the propagandist and I was the civic action guy. And I had a Montagnard interpreter, a Vietnamese interpreter, a young Vietnamese secretary, and there were a lot of other people that were working for me, but that was my office staff. And my Vietnamese interpreter was a guy named Sortan, but we called him Tony, and he was cousin to a guy who had been my other interpreter, my other main interpreter in the first tour, Pado, and the Americans called him Bardo because they had a problem with Pado. I had Tony, I had Mr. Cat, who was my Vietnamese interpreter, and I had Co Tien. Co is like Miss, um, and Co Tien. Well, Tony was a Montagnard, and he thought Co Tien was pretty hot, and she liked him.
Wow.
But there was nothing they could do about it. I mean,
Divisions.
it was just, it would have been a Romeo and Juliet situation with exactly the same results.
Wow.
And Mr. Cat, who was a Vietnamese and theoretically prejudiced against me, he was cool with it. He didn't care. He liked Tony. They got on fine.
Mm.
So there's the racial thing, and then there's the interpersonal thing. I mean, it's
Right.
there's more to everything. There's
Sure.
always more to everything. There's the details. The devil is in the details.
So when you
So,
think of all of these, what you've described, the assumption that 15% of the troops who are with you can't be trusted, the infiltration of South Vietnamese forces and operations by Viet Cong infiltrators, this civil war within the South itself, not Viet Cong South Vietnamese, but Montagnard Vietnamese. You're witnessing all of this. Was there ever a point, you're there again early in 63, you're there again in the mid 60s, you're there again in 68, you're there during Tet, you're back in 73. Was there ever a point where you thought, maybe this can work, maybe South Vietnam can be an independent functional country?
yeah,
You
yeah.
really did think that was possible?
Well, okay. Here's one of the problems.
Yeah.
Um, the the media don't want to admit that a situation has changed or that they were wrong.
Mm.
I mean, when I first went to Vietnam, the ARVN and the Vietnamese government and all of it was just it was a disaster. They couldn't find their ass with both hands, and um, but they got better. But the American public was never informed that they were getting better
Mm.
because, well, for one thing, for instance, Newsweek, their chief interpreter was an NVA colonel. He was an intelligence agent. I'm sure he wasn't the only one. So
Yeah,
obviously they targeted the American news agencies.
so it sounds like you're saying that in addition to the Viet Cong, in addition to the corruption of the South Vietnamese government, in addition to the divisions within the country, another significant adversary US troops and their allies faced in South Vietnam was the American media.
Um, yeah, to a very large, well, Tet's the perfect example. I
Yeah.
mean, as far as we were concerned, what happened during Tet was we had been wanting these people to come out and fight toe to toe for a decade at that, well, for about 5 years at that point that the Americans were there, and they did it. And we kicked their asses. I mean, from a military standpoint, the Tet Offensive was not only an American victory, it was one of the most lopsided victories in American military history. The Viet Cong were wiped out. Now the NVA, they mostly stayed. They didn't involve themselves with Tet very much. They mostly just stayed in the jungle and watched it. But the Viet Cong, who was the guys we were fighting in the first place, they were totally wiped out in the Tet Offensive.
And I think
But that's not the way it played in the American press.
right, and I think you say in the memoir that, for all of the bad press, so to say, that the ARVN forces got, that generally speaking, during Tet, they stood up and did a pretty good job.
Yeah, that's the word that I got. And okay, I was at that point I was the group information officer. I had a little magazine, and I did, I ferried correspondence around, um, and I was friends with them. I mean, those guys were just doing a job, uh, you know. But um, the conclusion I reached was that the the main enemy that the United States had in Vietnam was the foreign editor of the New York Times,
Mhm.
because whatever the New York Times led with, that's what everybody wanted to cover. And basically, what the American public was indoctrinated with was the worldview of the foreign editor of the New York Times.
Wow.
And you know,
So
so
do
that
you,
one guy had an immense power.
so do you think there's no way to know for certain because it didn't happen, but just as a thought exercise, let's say the journalists are, um, for example, the stories that come back from Tet, was it a surprise? Yes. Did we really know it was going to happen? Not really. Did the U.S. forces, the ARVN
That's
forces,
not,
our
that's not
Australian
true at
allies?
all. That's
Oh,
not true at all. We knew it was coming. We just didn't know exactly when or how.
right. Yeah. So right. So we didn't know exactly. We knew something was coming. We didn't know exactly how. But did the U.S., ARVN, generally speaking, our Australian allies, did these forces respond quickly, effectively, and did the Viet Cong get their tails busted? Absolutely. Had as a thought exercise, I mean, had the stories that came back to the U.S. been fairer, broader, deeper, less ideological, do you think that might have made a difference in how things unraveled in Vietnam?
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we look, when the war started, Americans were still in the grip of the World War II, red, white, and blue thing.
Mhm.
And I mean, you're probably too young to remember, but I remember World War II. I mean, I was 8 when it ended, but I remember it. And uh, the press was okay. One of the things I said that I used to say is that um, the American, the U.S. has only fought one war without censorship, and that's the war we lost. And since then, we fought every war without censorship, and we haven't won a one. During Tet, it started. It started a day before it started in the rest of the country in the Trong, which was the town I was in, and I fought. I mean, serious fighting. It was the biggest battle I'd ever been in, but all I had. I mean, I was not a troop commander. I had a magazine staff basically, although they were GIs. But
Yeah.
we
Right.
were anyway. We fought all night that first night, and then in the next
Yeah.
3 days, I was pretty much all over the country just checking out how guys had done, and it was the highest I've ever seen morale in Vietnam. Everybody was just like elated because we had killed those bastards. I mean, we murderlated them, you know, and it was amazing. And
Hmm.
then I got my rice paper Far East edition of Newsweek. Oops. Well, gee, this isn't what happened. You know, well, I knew a lot of correspondents, so I obviously I got the, what's the deal here? And they were saying, well, we just printed what they told us in the 5 o'clock follies in Saigon. So you can't really blame the press for printing what they've been told, but it was a lie. It was, I mean, it was, I
Wow.
don't know whose lie it was. That's the thing. You can't pin down whose lie it was, but it was a lie. We we
I
prevailed in Tet.
yeah, and the well, so you've got the footage from the embassy. That's very dramatic. You've got Cronkite offering his opinion that we're at a stalemate. We're not losing, but we can't win. We're at a stalemate. You've got President Johnson, who looks to me like he just kind of says, "I'm giving up." And what I'm hearing you describe is, you're up and down the country. You're reporting. You're working with this magazine. You are seeing unambiguous victory. The VC hit us with everything they had on Tet, and we beat the mess out of them. High morale, unambiguous victory. And then from the media and from the American political machine, what you're getting is the opposite of that, a sense of we've just, been devastated or something like
It
that.
was like bringing home a straight A report card and having your mother kick your ass.
Was that in your mind? And see, now we're talking about something that's psychological, right? The psychological impact of that was we always see Tet as a turning point. Do you agree, first of all, that Tet was a turning point, but it was a turning
Oh yeah,
point it was a turning point for the wrong reason. It was a turning point because the U.S. and our allies, the victory we had was not recognized, was not
yeah,
sufficiently
yeah.
recognized.
That's it. I mean, after Tet, I had no hope of winning that war after Tet. And
Because of how things were interpreted in the States and in the media, not because of what was happening on the ground in Vietnam.
yeah, yeah, the country was not behind us. Period. After Tet, the country was not behind us. The United States did not think they could win that war, and they didn't think they should win that war. Most of them, by that point, were convinced that the North Vietnamese really represented the totality of the Vietnamese people, which was, I mean, I don't know what the percentages were, but that wasn't true. You know, I mean, okay, when Vietnam was first organized, um, the people who did not, I mean, it was North Vietnam was a communist state, and the people who did not want to live under communism went south.
All right.
So there were a lot of North Vietnamese in the South Vietnamese government. There were, and also there were a lot of infiltrators that were sent south. Uh, so that was a huge problem.
Mm.
Um, but there were plenty of people in South Vietnam who did not want to be taken over by communism, and were very serious about it.
One of the things that I really appreciate about the memoir is I love people who um, just want to be excellent at whatever, whether it's ice skating or running or painting or whatever. And it's clear that you were thrilled, if I can use that word, by the chance to excel at being a special forces officer.
Still am,
Yeah, and
still am, who have been that.
yeah, and so people just you can practice and you can train and you learn from mistakes, but there are inbuilt things and you say, oh, that person's a natural teacher. That person's a natural athlete. And when I read the book and when I listen to you, I think, okay, this is a natural born special forces person. This is a natural
I kind
born
of
lawyer.
was. I kind of was, except I was not in good physical shape when I went in the Army. I
You
worked
mentioned
my
that,
way.
yeah. Yeah, you mentioned
Yeah,
that. But
but I toughened up a little bit. But
yeah,
okay, uh, you've touched on something that I would like to expound on a bit,
sure.
and it's something I didn't appreciate at the time because I didn't think in these terms. But
Mm,
when I got to Special Forces, well, when I first read about it, I thought this is, I mean, our ancestors were uh, the OSS Jedburghs in World War II,
mm,
and um, I was a big fan of a movie about them when I was a kid, and then when I read that that mission had been taken over and expanded within the U.S. Army, I thought, well, that's the outfit for me, and I looked into it. Um, but when I got there, when I got to Okinawa, to the first Special Forces group, I was just immediately seduced by the spirit of Special Forces. There is just a, you know, attitude and spirit are synonyms in a way.
mm,
You know what I mean? And the Special Forces attitude, um, I noticed right away, first of all, that all these guys expected to be opposed, but none of them expected to be stopped. And they had, but they absolutely had no illusions. They knew what they were dealing with. They knew what the odds were. They knew the whole thing, and they saw the humor in it. I was absolutely convinced it was the first Special Forces group was the most elite military unit that had ever existed in the history of the human race.
mm.
And forget the Knights of the Round Table, forget Robin Hood's Merry Men. We are the guys,
Yeah.
and um, that's of course almost every unit feels that way, but
Mm. Let me
but I felt that way.
let me ask you.
But yeah, yeah,
So let me pick up on that. You're describing these special forces guys a little bit. It's not that they're overconfident. They have a sense of the adversary. They have a sense of the difficulties, and they expect opposition. But insofar as it depends on them, they're not going to be stopped. That's one characteristic. Let me give you a thought exercise. Let me pretend I'm some colonel or something, and I've got 200 soldiers out here, and they're all good soldiers. They'll all make it to E4 or whatever before their enlistment's up. But what I'm asking you to do is, of these 200 soldiers, I need help to find the 5 who are really warriors. So we've got good soldiers, but I need to find the warriors, the real warriors. What
yeah.
characteristics are you going to look for?
Um, well, what do you look for? You look for commitment. You look for um, joy.
Mm.
You look for people that are just, man, this is great. I can jump out of airplanes. I can shoot guns. I can blow stuff up. How cool is that? You know?
I can walk through the jungle in the quiet and just think about the operation to come.
Yeah,
So that's interesting. So commitment and joy, people who say, wow, not that I have to jump out of this plane, but that I get to jump out of this plane. Not that I have
yeah,
to walk through this jungle, but that I get to walk through this jungle. I mean, just as an example, very few people in the world get to set up an ambush,
oh
but
yeah,
I get to do that and to take joy in
yeah,
that kind of activity.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I have a couple of times had that somewhat. Okay, okay. Immediate action ambush drill. If you get ambushed, and you do the instinctive thing and get down behind a tree and start plinking back, and they will pick you to pieces. The immediate action drill for an ambush is just to turn and charge.
Mm.
That's your best chance to prevail, is to just turn and charge.
Wow.
And so what you need is a unit of guys who are so interconnected that when that happens, they get that click in the head and they all together, 5 meters apart, leaps and bounds, all of that, all the stuff that they've been trained to do. They just do it. That's an elite unit.
Yeah.
The average unit, they're going to get down behind a tree and get picked to pieces.
Wow. Just a couple more questions. You received 4 Purple Hearts as a result of
Well,
Vietnam.
okay. Here's the thing about Purple Hearts. Uh, they are given for wounds caused by enemy action. Well, within that definition, if you get a paper cut from a captured enemy, I don't know if anyone has ever done this, but
Right. But
if you
technically,
by the rules, you can get a Purple Heart for a paper cut from a captured enemy document, or you can get one because you're dead.
mm,
So it's I
mm,
got 2 for punji stakes. That's no big deal. Uh, you know, take a shot of antibiotic and slap a band-aid on it and go on.
mm.
Uh, that's 2 of them. Now the other 2, well, I got my left nut shot off. That's you know attention grabbing, and and I lost 2 nerves and an artery out of my right arm and had to retire from the Army. So
I wonder if you would be willing to choose one of those 2. One Purple Heart, you lose a left testicle, um,
yeah,
and then the other, your arm is wounded, and you say in the book you kind of assumed that maybe your life was done, and or that next maybe you'd lose your arm, but you do keep your arm, but there's enduring damage, and you're forced to retire from the Army. Would you be willing to pick one of those 2 and just sort of tell us the story?
okay. The bad one, the one where I got shot in the arm. I was out in the Ashaw Valley with Project Delta with with the Vietnamese Ranger Battalion and their American advisors, and we got stuck on the LZ. We only got half the unit in on the first lift, and we had to wait for the other people to come back. And the choppers took a break for lunch, and by the time they got back, we were surrounded by a couple of battalions of NVA. And when the shooting started, I was actually sitting on a downed helicopter in the middle of the LZ. And so I went over and jumped into a B-52 crater. Then I jumped out of that B-52 crater and ran into another B-52 crater that was closer to the wood line. And then I ran to the wood line, at which point I was picked up by a couple of guys who said, look, we got guys trapped in this B-52 crater, and we need, some of them were wounded. We need to get them out. And it was the same one I just escaped from.
Wow.
The first one. And so I went with these guys, and they couldn't get anybody else to go with them, but I went with them. And they were going to run out to the B-52 crater, which they did. And I tripped over a root and fell down and didn't run out there with them. So I was right on the edge of the tree line with when these guys started to come out, and I could see where they were being fired at. So I attempted to hold down. I said, "Come on in, I'll hold it." I was standing on a high dirt bank, so they could run under my fire.
And then you'd give
And
them covering fire as they came in.
yeah,
Yeah.
So these guys all barreled out of the thing and ran past me, but the last two guys, who were the same two guys who had got me, they one of them was wounded, and he needed help getting up this dirt bank I was standing on. So I had to stop firing to lean down to help pull him up. And the minute I did that, I got shot in the right arm, and it severed an artery. So I was getting, arterial blood spurting. Well, when that happens, you got about 3 minutes, you know. So I thought, there's no way I can get this guy up this bank, and I got 3 minutes to live if I don't get this fixed. So I sprinted through a lot of rocket fire to the aid station, got it wrapped up, and sent some guys back to pull up those two guys. Well, apparently, when I ran off, they stopped shooting at them. They assumed they were dead, I suppose. So, but I forget this kid's name. It was something like Bavinger, but it wasn't Bavinger. Anyway, I talked to him later, and he said that he thought they were waiting there 15 minutes. Well, to me, it was like 2 seconds before I got those guys back. But my arm was halfway wrapped up, so it had to be a little more time than that. And what he thought was 15 minutes was probably 5 or maybe even 3. I don't know. But anyway, one of those guys, John Link, died. And that was, I felt so bad about that. I just felt horrible about that. And some years later, and it was at the 50th anniversary of Special Forces in Fayetteville, the Special Forces Association had their annual convention, but it was the 50th anniversary. So I'm standing in this hotel lobby shooting the breeze with various guys. And I was talking to this one guy, and he said, I went through training group with John Link. And that was the guy who had died. And I said, oh God. And he said, I read in War Story how bad you felt about that. And he said, I talked to his mother. And she said, not to feel bad about that, because you did. It's been a long time, and I still get that. It's been a long time, and I still get that.
Well, what you write in the book is that, John Link came back, he was wounded. You're trying to get him out. And as you're trying to get him out, then you're shot in your right arm.
Yeah.
As you say, an artery's been hit. And if this thing, and since you've been shot, you can't continue to pull him anyway. And then, so you need to get, your arm bandaged up. But there's that thing that you often hear from vets that you replay it again and again and again. Could I have done that a different way? Because, he does end up being killed in action.
I couldn't. That was the deal.
This might be a really stupid question, and so feel free just to ignore it. But
Hey, I taught freshman English.
yeah, well, I mean, if by some miracle somehow you could sit down for 5 minutes with John Link tomorrow, what would you say to him?
Sorry. And knowing Link, he would probably just shrug and say, shit happens. I mean, you just, you know, you take that, um, you just take it as it comes. You, it's your life. It's the way you live. Um, I'm glad I didn't die in Vietnam, but I do feel it was maybe fate in a way, because I feel like I was supposed to write that book.
I'm really glad you did. And like and I've read hundreds of Vietnam War memoirs by now. Just recently got around to War Story. Um,
Uh-huh.
but I'm very glad I did. It's unique. Um, it approaches the war from just a unique vantage point, and I really appreciate that book. I know that you've written many others, including recently here. Just the last question: when you look back on your long relationship with Vietnam in that time of conflict, from late 63, 3 tours in 63, a couple minor wounds with punji sticks, but then more significant wounds, 4 Purple Hearts altogether. Going back as a correspondent in 73, which, we haven't talked about that, but so we're talking about a 10-year relationship, roughly, you and that war. When you look back on that, what does how would you summarize it? What does all of that mean? What was all of that about? What's the takeaway from all of that in your mind?
Well, the takeaway was personal. I mean, geopolitically, we didn't accomplish our goal, and yet in an odd sort of way, we did. Um, the Russians were in Vietnam for a while after we left, and the
Mm.
Vietnamese didn't like them at all. They used to refer to them as Americans without money, and but GIs are greeted like long lost brothers. By the very guys we fought against. Okay, I got to tell you a story,
Please do,
and
yeah.
and also a book recommendation, which is a novel, The Barking Deer by Jonathan Rubin, who
Hmm.
was an SF,
The barking.
and
Okay.
it's a terrific book. He went back to Vietnam after the book was published, and he took a couple of copies with him, and he went back to the village where his team had been. The village was probably outside the camp. I'm not sure of the exact setup, but anyway, he went back and he gave a copy of this book to the shaman of the village, who couldn't read.
Hmm.
It's probably the only book he'd ever seen, but he put it in his medicine bag as a sacred item.
Hmm.
And then Reuben went to Hanoi, and Reuben is a linguist. He spoke the Montagnard dialect. He spoke Vietnamese. Is a brilliant man. And so he was on the street in Hanoi with a Vietnamese friend, and this guy pointed at a house, and he said, "That's General Giap's house."
Wow.
And Reuben said, "Really?" And the guy said, "Yeah. Why don't you go knock on the door? He loves to talk to GIs."
Wow. Wow.
And so Reuben went over, and Jacques invited him in for tea, and they had a lovely conversation. And he gave him a copy of The Barking Deer, which he put on his bookshelf between Lao Tzu and Ho's memoirs.
Hmm. That's amazing.
I just think that is
Amazing.
the coolest story
Oh,
to
it
come out
is.
of Vietnam.
That is. And I've been to Vietnam a few times in the past few years, and I have hope for the country, you know, that that, they still call themselves communists, but the economy clearly is turning toward the free market. I hope that continues and that
My
Vietnam will
old
prosper.
my old outfit, the First Special Forces Group, trains with them.
Really. Wow.
Yeah,
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, U.S. Navy ships paying port of call visits there in Vietnam.
Cameron
Yeah,
Bay.
that's right.